the idea came that it would be really interesting to visualize texts as structure. First, it was like an art project, how we can visualize a text as a structure of interconnected concepts, and then I developed it into a software tool.
Could you maybe explain how these network graphs work from a first principle?
We would take the words that carry significant meaning inside. So for example, build a network, and we get rid of how, do, you, and so on. So it's basically taking the concepts out of the language.
Is there a policy on maybe not uploading confidential data to InfraNodus?
We have a private mode actually. You can create a new graph and then you use a switch that you want to be in the private mode, and that means that nothing will be stored on the server.
All right, Dmitry, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Yusuf.
Thank you so much for doing this. Really cool. Today we'll talk about InfraNodus. So what is actually InfraNodus? How did you build it? And this is a full-time project of yours. So I'd like to understand more how knowledge graphs work and how, for example, marketers or business owners could leverage it for their own purposes. But before I jump into that, can you give the audience maybe an overview of who are you and what is your background?
Yeah, so I'm Dmitry. I have been working in many different fields, starting from economics and maths to visual arts, movement, choreography. So I kind of really was always interested to try as many things as possible. And I also really like writing, and I've been writing a lot. And then at some point, I just realized that I would like to connect all of those dots together in some way. And then the idea came that it would be really interesting to visualize texts as structures. And first, it was like an art project, how we can visualize a text as a structure of interconnected concepts. And then I kind of went from there and developed it into a software tool.
Yeah. How did you come up with the idea, though? Because I think from a first principle, it's quite easy to understand what it means in terms of a network graph. But how does it help us understand the world around us better?
Yeah, I think it's kind of really strongly based in my personal experience of doing many things and kind of feeling intuitively that there's a connection between them, and always trying to find how they can relate in an interesting way and how you can connect them, and through connecting them coming up with new ideas, insights, and so on. So I think it's kind of like a very natural thing that humans do, that they like to connect things together, and when they're connected, then they start making sense. Even as I'm Russian, French, but Russian is my native language. The word for meaning in Russian, it means смысл. So it's you actually have different thoughts and they're connected together. And this is when you have meaning. So even in the etymology of the word, there is some kind of connection between things that generates this aha moment, like a realization that something actually makes sense. So I think for me, it was that.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Could you maybe explain how these network graphs work from a first principle? Let's say you have a couple of words or word arrangements. How do you build then this network?
Yeah, so when, for example, I take your question, how do you build this network? We would take the words that carry significant meaning inside. So for example, build a network, and we get rid of how, do, you, and so on. So it's just build a network, and we make a connection between them. But then if we imagine that we continue following the traces of language as we speak, right? So then we would also take the node language and speak, and then we make another connection, but language was connected to the graph before, and then we kind of have a structure coming up. So it's basically taking the concepts out of the language, the individual words, but you can also use entity detection and detect entities like locations or more complex concepts, which are maybe consisting of several words at the same time. And then you build a trace of how they connect to one another. And then this gives you graph structures. And it's not only the words which are next to each other, but that are used in the same context, actually. So in the case of InfraNodus, we use a gap of four concepts. And it's kind of it makes sense in the way that it's based on so-called landscape reading model that says that you can be kind of easily aware of the piece of information that you receive within a 10-second period, more or less. So basically, if I ask you what we spoke about 5 seconds ago, it will be easier for you to recall than if I ask you what exactly I said half a minute ago. And it's kind of like a visual representation of how we perceive language in the end, because we follow those words, how they connect to one another. And we also consider them to be connected not only if they're next to each other, but if they have a gap of one or two words in between. And then gradually we build a structure. And then, first of all, this structure would be very chaotic, but then we use some tools from graph theory and network theory to represent this connectivity in a way that would be human readable and that would also carry some information. So, for example, the first thing that we do is that we apply a force atlas layout, which pushes the most connected nodes or words like apart from one another. So then you can clearly see what are the most connected concepts, and the concepts which are connected to those most connected words will be grouped around them. So that helps you visualize groups of ideas together and how they connect to one another. And then you can, for example, identify topics based on that, because we will tend to be using the same sort of vocabulary to describe one thing and then another vocabulary to talk about something else. You would be able to visually really clearly see how that happens. And then the more influential words, for example, they will be bigger on the graph. So you can also use the metric of between the centrality or degree to show which words have more influence in the discourse and so on. So then you can kind of like apply these measures and visualize meaning in that way.
That's super interesting. How, for example, I mean, for us, it's kind of intuitive, right? The word language and speech is somehow connected. But how does this model know how these words are connected?
Yeah, so it's really based on co-occurrence at this point. So at the first analysis of the text that you upload to InfraNodus, be it like a PDF document, you can also write or speak into it even, it's just going to use the words co-occurrence. So that's like a huge difference actually from how embedding models work, because when you think about vector representations, for instance, and the embeddings and RAGs, like very hype topics at the moment. And people always think that InfraNodus actually represents that, but it doesn't. And this, I think, is a very important difference, because with embeddings, you have a general representation of a certain set. Like, let's say if you take OpenAI's model GPT-4, they analyzed a lot of different content, and they build these vector representations of how words or sentences, depending on what you actually use to make these vector representations, how they connect to one another, but it's going to be in the context of the data which they analyze. So, for example, if they took the whole of internet, then the word language and word would be connected to one another, because obviously most of the time they're probably used in the same context. But then in the case of InfraNodus, we actually take like a specific text that you're working on, and we only look at the co-occurrences within that text. And that's very interesting, because it really shows you the contextual differences of this text from other texts. So you can see that in this particular text, maybe the word is not connected to language. Maybe when you talk about words, you're talking about meaning and imagination. But when you use language in that text, you're only talking about, let's say, like people and communication, for instance. So then you see clearly what the contextual differences are. And that's particularly useful actually when you analyze keyword combinations that people use to search for certain things, because you can see how people actually tend to think, like what are the co-occurrences of terms that those people have when they search for this thing. So if someone is searching language and communication, then you will see that. But maybe if you fed it to a normal model, it would not see this connection, because it just takes the whole internet as a base.
Yeah, I see. That makes sense. So maybe walk us through a use case, maybe SEO, maybe a marketing or business use case. How would someone actually start to use that? So you give an unstructured text, which kind of then transforms into structured data. And when does AI come in, and how do we find gaps or identify blind spots in our own knowledge, maybe using InfraNodus?
My favorite case is when I actually want to write about something, maybe an article on how InfraNodus works. So when I want to create a video, obviously, I would like people to actually find it and to be also interested in it and to connect to something that also touches them. So my first step is always to use InfraNodus to actually see what people are searching for when they search for this topic. So for example, if I make a video on ChatGPT, I'm going to go to InfraNodus, I'm going to type in ChatGPT, and I'm going to use the keyword visualization feature, which basically extracts what you normally see on Google. When you search for something, it shows you what else you could search for. Like if you type ChatGPT, it's going to be ChatGPT AI, ChatGPT model, ChatGPT website, or something like that. So it's like all the things that people tend to search for when they search for ChatGPT. So that gives you a picture of informational demand. And we get all those keyword combinations, visualize them as a graph based on co-occurrences. So you can see that, for example, people use ChatGPT a lot with the concept of AI and with website, and maybe they're also looking for login, for instance, and they want it to be free. So then you kind of start seeing patterns of how people search for something, and you understand that, okay, in that case, if I'm interested in ChatGPT, I should probably also talk about AI. I should talk about GPT. I should also mention that it's free, and maybe login I'm not so interested in because that's obviously something technical, so you can get rid of some stuff as well based on this representation. And sometimes you find really interesting stuff. Like, for instance, when I was making a video about, I think, YouTube channels and how you can analyze them with InfraNodus and prompts, like the word generator comes up a lot, and summarization. So that gives me an idea that, okay, if I want to write about this topic, if I want to make a video about this, I should also talk about summarization and generators, because that's what people search for. So that would be the first step, to kind of discover the search patterns that people have and get a picture of informational demand, like what they actually search for. Then the next step would be to see what the supply is, right? So I want to see what they search for, but now I want to see what they actually find. So then I will analyze Google search results exactly for that query. And I'll see that, for example, they kind of find the same things that they search for, but there might be some discrepancies. So that will be like an interesting part, that I will see that, okay, they actually search for generators and summarizers, but it's not what they find on Google. So then I have like a moment, okay, so if I want to make content that will be interesting for my users, I should offer something that they cannot find yet. And then I can actually overlay those two graphs on InfraNodus, the search results for a search query and the keywords which I used to find something. And then I see that, okay, I actually have this difference, or like a gap, where they are trying to find something on generators and summarizers, but they don't have it yet on the first page results, at least, and then I'm going to be like, okay, so then I should really target those topics, because they're not finding it, or it's hard to find them, but they actually search for them. So I'm really catering to the user's needs in this case. And then once I identify those differences and gaps, then I'm going to write an article. I'm going to put this into InfraNodus, visualize the whole article. I will usually not try to write it in a way where I completely only cater to what I discovered in InfraNodus, because obviously I also want to write about things which are somehow interesting to me as well, right? Mm-hmm. But then I'll feed it into InfraNodus to see how well it overlaps this graph of supply and demand, whether I'm targeting the niche, and then I'm going to add some words or some ideas, or maybe I will see that I'm missing something. And then finally, when you ask about the structural gaps, once I have this representation of the article based on all of this information and the analysis of supply and demand, I'm going to look at the graph, and the graph allows me to see not only what are the most recurrent patterns, but also what's missing. So what are the gaps between some topics which exist in this graph? So I might see that, for example, when I talk about summarization and generating prompts, and maybe there is another topic on visualization, for instance, that they're not connected. So I'm going to be like, okay, I might write about something that connects those two topics, because they seem to be present both in demand and supply, but no one is connecting them. So I'm going to try to connect those topics together to actually bring in a new conceptual relation into this discourse, and therefore contribute positively to it.
I see.
So that's how it would work.
And that's pretty cool. I was wondering, let's say there's two companies, company A, company B, they're both competitors. Like, how would you make sure, like, this is probably where the human in the loop comes in, like, who is the better prompter and who uses InfraNodus more intelligently, I guess? Is the probably the one who will win at the end, right? When it comes to writing the articles, coming up with new ideas, that sort of stuff. Like, do you see it the same way, or is there more to it than only using
Like,
InfraNodus
in
plus
which
human
sense
intelligence?
you mean exactly?
Let's say, for example, I'm a marketer, right? Like, I would do some SEO research about specific keywords. Could be about YouTube, could be about ChatGPT, for example. But I have someone else who maybe has the same human capabilities that I have. He would also, or she would also use InfraNodus, and maybe has the same way, wants to approach it the same way that I do. Like, where's my competitive edge when using InfraNodus? Is it who understands it better, or like who's the better prompter? Like, how does it work?
Yeah. So if you know that InfraNodus exists, that's already a competitive edge because it's actually not used yet by so many people. So, for example, if you're a marketer, you'll probably use Ahrefs, SEMrush, or if you
Correct.
have a bit less money, then Uber suggests or something like that, right? So you would kind of like use the same tools as everyone else, but if you have InfraNodus, then you would be able to actually visualize those patterns, find the gaps, and so on. So that's already an edge because not so many people use it yet. But if, let's say, like we both use InfraNodus, I actually don't think it's based so much on like how well we know the tool, although there are some features which can help you kind of get like an edge if you understand how graphs work. And I think like a very easy way of explaining how it can work is if you think of a network of words as a social network. So it basically shows us which words like to hang out together. So you're building a network like a social network of words. And if you think of social networks, your task here as a marketer is to kind of like maybe the word infiltrate is not a very good one, but it's kind of that, like you want to infiltrate into the social network of words with your own discourse in a way that positively contributes to the functioning of this network. Like if you have good intention, you want to come in and you want to make new connections, you want to introduce the words which haven't yet spoken together that could maybe communicate, or the groups of words, it's like groups of people. So see, if you think of it in this way, then you already have an edge because you will be thinking in this positive way of how you can contribute to this discourse in a way that makes it more interconnected, in a way that identifies the gaps inside and proposes connections between them. So for example, in InfraNodus, on the analytics panel, we have this blind spots tab that shows the gaps, but under it, there is another one that's called conceptual gateways. And this is a very interesting feature, I think, where it shows which words have not so many connections, but the connections they have are very important. So they connect to very highly connected words. And if you think of a social network, it's like, imagine you want to become a part of something. If you come to the most connected people, they will probably not have time to speak to you. So, but if you come to the unconnected people, then you will take a very long time to build your social connections there. So what you want to do is to actually find the people that know not so many people, but the people they know are important, right? So that's what InfraNodus shows you exactly, that some words or some concepts in this network, they have not so many connections, but they connect to the most important part. So you want to actually focus on those words and then enter into this discourse based on those concepts. So if you kind of think of the network as a social network, then I think it already gives you like an edge and helps you get the most out of it somehow.
Absolutely. Hey, you get me super excited, Dimitri. I definitely have to try it out. I didn't have the time yet, but I definitely want to give that a try, and probably also to the people listening to this podcast right now. Give it a try and maybe leave some feedback in the comments. I'm wondering,
Sure.
we're using InfraNodus to identify blind spots that we might have as human beings, but does InfraNodus have blind spot itself where we can, as humans, maybe fill these blind spots? And then this is kind of an iterative process. So I'm helping InfraNodus helps me. Is this how you see the human in the loop, but also InfraNodus, AI in the loop?
Yeah, I think the human in the loop is a very important part because I never like it when we think of AI as something that will do the work for us. So where
Yeah.
AI comes in, and actually, like, it's not something that was there from the beginning. So from the beginning, there was just the graph and the explanations of how to approach the graph. But I saw that for some people, it was very difficult, for instance, to understand how to interpret the graph or how to find these connections, or even if I show you that those clusters of words, they should be connected, how would you actually come up with an interesting idea based on it? So this is where the AI comes in, is that you are enabled now to feed those clusters of words to AI and ask it to generate some idea or a question. And actually, I'm also kind of like insisting on the idea that it should be a question that you ask first, because you might want to answer this yourself, and then this is going to help you generate a new idea. But if you don't have time or you don't understand how to answer this question, then you feed it back to the AI model and then it generates an answer for you. But I think if you approach it in this iterative way where you kind of have this process of using the graph, generating ideas, then you read through them, then you think, then you maybe put something back into InfraNodus, it generates a new one. So that would be the best approach, I think, rather than just expecting the AI to give you the full answer. Because if I think back of the previous question you had, like this is where you would have a competitive advantage. If you just want the AI to generate the answer for you, then it's just going to be a generic result that everyone will have. But if it's you who is involved in the loop and you're kind of like really working actively with it, then I think it's going to be much more nuanced and interesting.
Yeah, super interesting. You could also do visual Google search with InfraNodus, but also do like scientific research with it. I'm wondering how much of it is AI, like based on a large language model, or does InfraNodus have access to the internet directly and
Yeah, it
doing
has
actually?
access to the internet. So it's one of the main features actually is that you can import all kinds of data. So you can import Google search results, you can import Google search queries that people use when they search for things. You can import Twitter feeds for a certain keyword or all the tweets of a certain user, for instance. You can then upload like a CSV table, use Google Sheet, so you can get information from all over the place on the internet in real time, and you visualize it as a graph. And at this point, there is no AI because we just like get the data and show it to you, right? And the AI comes in when we start to interpret this data. So for example, when we identify those topical clusters, we use the AI to get names for them. So it's more human readable somehow, right? Like instead of
Yeah.
you trying to interpret what those 8 keywords mean, we ask the AI to make the interpretation for you and to come up with a short explanation of what this topic could be about. Then when you generate questions based on those gaps that you find in the discourse, for instance, this is where you also can use the AI and ask it to generate a question for you instead of you trying to think how the concept of language connects to communication, for instance. So it's kind of used when you want to make these interpretations and to stimulate you to think in that way.
I see. We've talked about so many possible use cases that InfraNodus can cover. I'm wondering, what can InfraNodus not do? Is there like any limitations to it until now?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of like a problem of InfraNodus that it can do too much, I think. So
Okay.
people sometimes don't really understand what they could use it for. But also, I'm not the kind of person who would like to make a tool just for one thing. I understand it would be more business friendly because, like, it's usually nice when you just see something and like, okay, it's just going to do search engine optimization, for instance, and that's it. And you can use InfraNodus for that, but you can also use it for writing books, right? So yeah, it can do a lot of things. What it cannot do yet, I think, like one thing that people ask, which is not yet realized, is the ability to upload your whole computer on it. Like they always ask this thing, like I have one 1 million documents. Can I visualize them all? And I'm like, sure, but even if you could do that, this graph would be so dense and so generic because if you imagine like 1 million documents, then you'll probably have 100 words which will always connect. So it's gonna like actually take you a lot of time to filter through it. So you need to filter through your data first and maybe to upload one folder which is on a specific topic. So you kind of start looking into your content from that specific direction. So I think this is what it cannot do yet, but it's an interesting challenge because I see it like the same user experience problem as Google Maps, like you can see the whole Earth, but when you zoom out, you just see the continents. Then when you zoom in, you see countries. Then when you zoom in, you see streets and houses and so on. So I think in the future, we'll implement this feature that you will be able to have these layers of abstraction. And if you want, you can just upload like everything that you accumulated in your whole life and just see a general picture. But if you zoom in, then you will have a bigger level of granularity. And it kind of works already because you have like a general graph view, but it cannot process like millions of documents yet. So I think that's something that we will work on for the
Yeah.
future.
Yeah, great. What about, let's say I own a company and maybe I would like to be interested in, I don't know, uploading PDF from a client. Is there like a policy on maybe not uploading confidential data to InfraNodus because it might be leaked somehow? Is there some kind of policy that you advise people on what to do and
Yeah,
what not to do?
we have a private mode actually. So what you can do is that you can create a new graph and then you use like a switch that you want to be in the private mode, and that means that nothing will actually be stored on the server. So you only send this PDF for processing. The file is not saved. No information is saved in any database. There's no log, no trace. You will visualize a graph. You work with the graph, but the moment that you close the tab in the browser, it's gone. So that would be kind of like a way that if you have something confidential, this is how it would work, and this would be the best way to approach it.
I see. Interesting. You talked about future developments. Is there anything else that's on the roadmap for InfraNodus?
Oh yeah, a lot of things. We just created an extension that you can use when you browse the web or when you look at your Google Docs or YouTube videos. And yeah, I really like it because it just shows you, like, it actually generates those insights and questions automatically using the underlying graph structure of your content. So it's kind of like a movement towards not always showing the graph to people because some of them find it a bit too complicated. So we just kind of like take everything that InfraNodus does, then do it under the hood and just deliver you the insights. So the interesting questions and ideas based on the content that you're interacting with at the moment. And that extension will soon actually get a graph view, which will be 3D. So you will be able to visualize this information in 3D. And then the next step is that you could wear Apple Vision Pro and, like, imagine you have your data, a text that you like or that you're reading, and you just visualize it in 3D, and you could actually interact with it in a tangible and embodied way, like just like picking some data with your hands, then turning it around, zooming in, zooming out, a little bit like in a sci-fi movie. Like, you know, when they have all these interfaces from the 23rd century or something, when it's visualized in front of you. Because I don't think that actually glasses is a really good idea, but I think it's a necessary step until we have something that would be actually projected like a hologram in front of us, right? Like, so some kind of AR, but when I don't have to wear anything. I think that would be the most amazing use case, because then imagine we're having this conversation now, but in real time, we have a representation of it as a graph in front of us, and you would be able to see which topics we covered, which we didn't, and then like maybe you touch a couple of things in the graph in a real space, and then it produces an idea for you for what you could ask next, for instance, or what are the topics that we haven't covered yet. So for me, it's very interesting direction to kind of make this 3D real-time representation of a conversation or of a text.
Yeah, it sounds like Jarvis, like the vision of Jarvis movie. That's really, really cool. I'm thinking even from the engineering point of view, mechanical engineering, maybe it would be interesting not to maybe use words, but also knowledge graphs for like geometric data. For example, an engineer would create a CAD model, for example, and then it would relate everything that's related to that CAD model or looks similar to that specific CAD model. That could be also an interesting use case for engineers.
Yeah, I think definitely, like, that's why we always ask users to send us their ideas, and just to start from sending some data so we can see how we could represent it as a graph. Like we have a guy who's working with us, Thomas. He's a photographer, and for him it's very interesting to, for example, represent pictures also this way and so on. So yeah, there's definitely lots of different use cases.
Really nice.
Beyond language.
Yeah. How can people actually get started using InfraNodus?
Well, they can go on infranodus.com and then open an account. There is a 2-week trial, so they don't have to pay anything. And then if they like it, they then keep the subscription. Also, I really recommend to install the extension, because if you don't know so much how the graphs work, like, it can be like an easy entrance into it. And then, yeah, just like that.
Very simple. All right, really cool. What we talked about before the podcast, Dmitry, is kind of maybe a deep dive session where people can actually see it in action, or just, for example, visit your YouTube page. I think you have a ton of videos explaining how InfraNodus works, so that would be the next step, I guess. Any closing remarks, some ideas, some thoughts before we wrap up?
No, I just wanted to thank you for inviting me. I think it was a really great conversation. I also really like the questions that you ask. They're very, very much at the point. So yeah, it's been a pleasure to speak and to share.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dmitry, and hope to talk to you soon.
Likewise.